You know, most of the time police reports are filled with routine stuff. Traffic stops, break-ins, noise complaints. But every now and then, an officer writes something down that doesn't make sense. Something that doesn't fit into evidence or logic. These are the stories they don't talk about openly. The ones that stick with them long after the shift ends. Tonight, you'll hear 10 of those real accounts, and trust me, if these trained officers couldn't explain what happened, maybe no one can. Most of us think of police work as routine. Traffic stops, paperwork, and the occasional chase. But the truth is, officers often see things the rest of us couldn't imagine. These stories aren't about bravery medals or big arrests. They're about the moments that made even the toughest cops feel a chill down their spine. When I started digging into these accounts, I expected tension, maybe some suspense. But what I found left me unsettled. Because the scariest stories aren't always from haunted houses or ghost towns. Sometimes they come straight from a night shift on patrol. Imagine driving dark back roads alone, lights flickering, and hearing something you can't explain crackle through the radio. That's where these tales begin. Each one of these encounters is real, told by officers who swore they'd never forget what they saw. And honestly, the disturbing part isn't just what happened. It's how ordinary the night seemed before everything went wrong. So if you think police work is all routine, these stories might change your mind. By the end of this video, you might just find yourself double-checking the locks before going to bed. Let us start with the first story. A late-night call that turned into a nightmare none of the responding officers could explain. It started with a 911 call from a quiet suburban neighborhood. On the line, the dispatcher heard what sounded like frantic screaming before the call cut to static. When they traced the location, it pointed to an address locals knew well, an old abandoned house at the end of the block. No one had lived there in years, but now something seemed to be happening inside. 2 officers were sent to check it out, and for them, it was supposed to be another routine call, maybe a prank by teenagers or squatters who had found shelter. When they pulled up, the house looked exactly as neighbors had always described it. Dark windows boarded shut, paint peeling from the siding, and weeds climbing up the steps. Their flashlights cut through the night, the beams reflecting off broken glass scattered near the porch. It was obvious no one had taken care of the place in a long time, yet the call they received came directly from inside. That was the first thing that unsettled them. It just didn't add up. They forced the front door open with a loud crack. The hinges gave way easily, as if no one had touched them in decades. The moment they stepped inside, a blast of cold air washed over them. Not the kind of cold you expect in winter, but something sharper, biting, unnatural. Both men paused, letting their eyes adjust to the beam of their flashlights. Dust floated lazily in the air, disturbed for the first time in who knows how long. The first thing they noticed was the silence. For a house that was supposed to be echoing with screams, it was painfully still. Too still. Every creak of the wooden floor under their boots felt exaggerated, as though the house itself was listening. The living room was stripped bare, furniture draped in white sheets that had turned yellow with age. Cobwebs stretched across corners like veins, undisturbed for years. It didn't look like a place that had hosted any human life recently. They swept the ground floor methodically. The kitchen still held a few rusted utensils, a refrigerator door slightly ajar, but nothing that suggested people were inside. Then came the sound, faint but undeniable. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They weren't downstairs. They were coming from above. Both officers froze, the silence broken only by the echo of boots pacing back and forth overhead. Their eyes met in the dim light, and without saying a word, they knew what came next. Guns drawn, flashlights steady, they climbed the staircase carefully. Each step groaned beneath their weight. The sound of footsteps stopped the instant they reached the landing, leaving them standing in suffocating silence once again. They moved from room to room. The wallpaper upstairs was peeling in long strips, exposing rotted wood beneath. Broken furniture littered the floor, shards of glass crunched under their boots, but no sign of life. It was empty, completely empty, and yet the air still felt heavy, as if someone had been there only seconds before. Just as they were about to give up and head back down, the radio clipped to one officer's belt came to life with a sudden hiss. A voice, low, distorted, and impossible to place, spoke a single phrase: "Get out." The two men froze, staring at each other. That voice wasn't dispatch. The channel was clear. No other units were close enough to bleed through the signal. It made no sense. Before either could react, the sound of 3 heavy thuds echoed directly above them. It was the unmistakable weight of someone stomping hard on the floorboards. Adrenaline surged as they rushed back upstairs, determined to catch whoever was toying with them. They tore through each room again, opening every closet, every corner, but found nothing. Not a footprint, not a single disturbed patch of dust. The place looked exactly as it had before. As they regrouped near the front door, trying to make sense of what just happened, the sharp sound of wood cracking rang out from upstairs. The hallway closet door slammed shut with such force it rattled the walls. Both officers sprinted back up, yanked the door open, and shined their flashlights inside. Nothing. Just old wooden hangers swinging slowly as if invisible hands had brushed them seconds earlier. By now, both men were rattled. They'd dealt with break-ins, domestic disputes, even violent arrests, but nothing like this. They were trained to expect the unexpected, but this was different. This wasn't a suspect hiding or a prank gone wrong. This was something that couldn't be explained by any procedure in the manual. After clearing the house one last time, they stepped back outside to question the neighbors who had reported the screams. The stories were eerily consistent. They'd heard shouting, frantic yelling, even what sounded like a woman crying for help. But when the officers told them the house was empty, their faces drained of color. Several insisted no one had entered the property in years. Some even admitted they avoided walking past it at night. Back at the station, they ran the usual checks. The 911 call itself should have left some record, an originating number, a timestamp, something. But when the dispatcher pulled the file, there was nothing. No voice recording, no phone number, no trace at all. It was as if the call had never been made. All that remained was the static they had heard when the line cut off. Neither officer wanted to write the full details in their report. They kept it short, sticking to what they could reasonably explain. A search of the property showed no signs of forced entry beyond their own. No suspects located, no evidence collected. But off the record, both men admitted the night had shaken them. The cold air, the footsteps, the voice on the radio, none of it fit into any rational explanation. Months passed, but the memory stayed. Even when other calls blurred together in routine, this one never left their minds. Whenever new recruits joined the force, the story inevitably came up. Some dismissed it as exaggerated, others joked it was just nerves. But the two officers never laughed when they told it. They always ended it the same way, by saying they would never step foot inside that house again. What disturbed them most wasn't just the unexplained sounds or the voice telling them to leave. It was the thought that whatever had been inside wanted them gone, and had the power to make itself heard. To this day, the house still sits at the end of the street, windows boarded, lawn overgrown. Neighbors say they sometimes hear noises drifting through the night, though no one goes close enough to check. And that's the thing about stories like this. They don't end neatly, tied up with answers. They linger, like an itch at the back of your mind, a reminder that some places hold secrets best left alone. For the officers, it was just another call on the logbook. But for anyone who hears what they went through, it's a chilling reminder that not every 911 call leads to a person in need. Sometimes it leads to something much harder to explain, and that was just the first story. The second begins with a seemingly routine traffic stop that turned into something unforgettable. It was past midnight when the patrol unit rolled through a nearly empty street. The kind of night where everything felt still, where the only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional buzz from the radio. Then the light turned red ahead, and as the cruiser slowed, the officer noticed a car speeding through the intersection without hesitation. Instinct kicked in, lights flashed, and the vehicle slowed before neatly pulling over to the curb. At first glance, it was a standard procedure. Another traffic violation on a quiet night. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. The officer parked behind the car, stepped out and approached the driver's side with his flashlight in hand. He was already rehearsing the usual lines in his head. License, registration. Do you know why I pulled you over? But as the beam cut across the inside of the car, something was off. The seat was empty. No driver. He froze, staring at the empty leather seat. Maybe the driver had slipped out the passenger side quickly, maybe bolted into the shadows before he approached. But the doors were all shut tight. He circled the car once, tugging at each handle. All of them locked from the inside. The windows were fogged lightly, the engine still running with a low, steady hum. Everything about it felt normal, except for the fact that nobody was behind the wheel. Confused, he radioed for backup. Minutes later, another patrol unit arrived, and together they inspected the vehicle more carefully. The trunk was popped open, empty. The back seat held nothing but dust and a faded jacket, no signs of anyone hiding. They even checked under the hood, though it made no sense to think someone would be there. The engine purred along, steady as ever, as if the car itself didn't realize its driver was gone. When dispatch ran the plates, the chatter on the radio suddenly grew tense. The license number matched a man who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. Stranger still, the same car had supposedly been impounded in another county just days after his disappearance. There was no record of it being released. It should have been locked away in a police lot, not idling quietly on a dark street in the middle of the night. One officer leaned into the cabin, noting the odometer. It showed barely any new mileage since the day the car was logged as missing. A thin layer of dust clung to the dashboard as though no one had touched it in weeks. Yet the keys sat in the ignition, the engine alive, mocking them with the normality of it all. Then came the smell. Cigarette smoke, faint but distinct, lingering in the air. One of the officers swore it was fresh, like someone had just been puffing minutes before they arrived. But the ashtray was spotless. No burns, no stubs, nothing to explain where the smoke had come from. The more they searched, the less sense any of it made. With no other options, they had the car towed back to the station. Maybe in the daylight it would make more sense. Maybe evidence technicians would find something the night and their nerves had obscured. For the rest of the shift, the two officers couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of an empty driver's seat still burned in their minds, every detail of the stop replaying on a loop. By morning, the car was gone. Not stolen, not signed out, gone. The impound lot cameras told a story that made even less sense. One frame showed the car sitting exactly where they'd left it. The next, it was gone, as though it had been erased between blinks. No shadows, no suspicious figures, no tow truck, just gone. Investigators checked the paperwork from the supposed earlier impound. The signatures looked smudged, almost melted across the page as if written by a shaking hand or smeared by water. None of the names matched any officer who had been on duty at the time. It was as though the paper trail had been forced into existence, but not by anyone real. The more they tried to pin it down, the more it slipped through their fingers. The case was eventually filed away as unresolved. No evidence of a crime, no suspect, no clear explanation. Just a car that shouldn't have been there, tied to a man who never came home. Yet the officers who pulled it over never forgot. In reports, they stuck to the basics: traffic stop, empty vehicle, impounded. But when they spoke privately, the details spilled out. The cigarette smell, the static on the radio, the way the car seemed alive but abandoned, as if something invisible had been sitting in that driver-and seat until the moment the flashlight revealed the truth. For weeks after, both admitted feeling uneasy every time they pulled over a lone car at night. The routine felt tainted, no longer just another box to check off on a shift. Every time they walked up to a window, part of them braced for the beam of the flashlight to reveal nothing but emptiness. One officer confessed he still dreams about it, walking toward that car, hand on his holster, light flicking across the glass, only to find no one behind the wheel. The hum of the engine fills his ears in the dream, louder than it should be, drowning everything else out. And then he wakes, heart pounding, knowing the memory isn't just imagination. There's no comfort in the way it ended. The car's disappearance from the lot was never explained, the missing man never found, and the call log from the impound remained a mess of half-written details. It was a story that didn't fit into paperwork, one that couldn't be presented neatly in court or wrapped up in an official statement. It stayed alive instead as a kind of whispered tale among the officers, a reminder that not every mystery had an answer. What unnerved them most was how ordinary it all began. A red light violation on a sleepy street, a stop they'd made 100 times before. If they hadn't looked inside, if they'd just waved it off, maybe they'd never have known. But once they saw that empty seat, they couldn't unsee it. The silence, the hum of the idling engine, the faint scent of smoke in the air, all of it marked them in a way no violent arrest or high-speed chase ever had. And so the story lingers, passed between officers like a cautionary tale. It wasn't just a reminder to expect the unexpected, but a warning that sometimes what you find has no explanation at all. The missing driver, the impounded car that shouldn't have been there, the vanishing vehicle from the lot, all of it adds up to nothing that fits neatly into the world they knew. It left them with questions that may never be answered, questions they carry every time they pull someone over in the middle of the night. Because now they understood something no academy training could prepare them for. Sometimes the scariest part of a traffic stop isn't T who S in the driver S seat. It's when no one is there at all. And if that wasn't strange enough, the third story takes us far from highways, into a forest patrol where something other than humans seemed to be watching. 2 deputies were called late one evening after a string of reports came in from hunters and hikers who swore they'd seen strange lights flickering deep in the woods outside of town. It wasn't the first time locals had mentioned odd things happening in that stretch of forest, but usually it was written off as kids with flashlights or campers who had stayed out too late. Still, the calls that night all described the same thing. A glow weaving between the trees, vanishing and reappearing, almost as if it wanted to be seen. They drove down the dirt road, headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that clung low to the forest floor. The night had a heavy quality to it, like the air itself didn't want to be disturbed. Every tree seemed to lean closer, branches scratching at the mist as the cruiser crawled forward. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Both had been in the force long enough to know when a night felt wrong, and this one did. After a few miles, they parked and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under their boots swallowed quickly by silence. Radios crackled faintly against their belts, the only thing breaking the stillness. The air smelled damp, rich with pine and earth, but there was something else beneath it, something metallic, faint, like the tang of old rust. Every sound seemed sharper in that quiet. The snap of a twig underfoot echoed as though amplified, making them pause and scan the dark. Half a mile in, one deputy froze. Through the dense pines, a faint glow shimmered ahead. It flickered, unsteady, as if a lantern swayed in someone's hand. Relief brushed over them for a second. Maybe it really was just campers after all. They called out, their voices carrying into the dark, but no answer came. Instead, the glow dimmed until it nearly vanished, then flared again farther ahead, teasing them deeper into the forest. They pressed forward cautiously but soon realized something unsettling. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. No rustle of leaves in the breeze, no insects humming, no distant owls calling. Even the crickets had gone silent, as if the whole woods were holding its breath. The silence wrapped around them like a shroud, pressing against their ears until they could hear their own heartbeats pounding. That was when the snapping started, branches cracking heavy enough to rule out squirrels or deer. The sound came from just out of sight, circling them slowly. Both deputies immediately drew their weapons, commanding whoever was there to show themselves. Their voices echoed strangely, bouncing between the trees, but no answer came. Instead, the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if something unseen was pacing just beyond the reach of their flashlights. The glow ahead blinked once, then went out entirely. In its place, a whisper rippled through the trees. It was too faint to make out, just a murmur carried on the damp night air, but both deputies swore later that it sounded like words, though in no language either of them knew. They swept their flashlights across the forest desperately, beams slicing through mist and shadow, catching only branches swaying and shadows shifting in ways that made their eyes strain. Then one of the beams landed on something that froze them in place. Between the trees stood a tall figure, still and silent, watching. It wasn't clear, not fully human, more like the outline of a body made of shadow and light, wavering against the mist. For the briefest moment, it seemed to stand there, head tilted as if studying them. But when they aimed their lights directly at it, the space was empty. No tracks in the snow at their feet, no broken branches to mark movement. Nothing disturbed at all, as though the forest itself had erased it. The sudden screech of static from one deputy's radio made both of them flinch. The sound was harsh, grating, before a voice cut cleanly through the distortion. A single word: leave. The tone was flat, inhuman, yet unmistakably clear. Their training told them to hold their ground, but instinct screamed otherwise. They turned back toward the cruiser, walking quickly, trying to keep their breathing steady, though every nerve in their body begged them to run. Halfway back, the glow returned. This time it wasn't ahead of them. It was behind. It pulsed faintly, as though something was following, matching their pace. One deputy swore later that he felt a rush of cold air against his shoulder, like someone brushing past him in the dark, though no one was there. He said he didn't even turn to look. Some part of him knew he wouldn't like what he saw if he did. At last, they broke through the tree line and into the faint comfort of the cruiser's headlights. As soon as they reached the car, the glow disappeared, swallowed into the forest. And with it, the sounds of the woods returned. The crickets chirped again. A breeze rattled through the branches. It was as if nothing had happened at all, as if the forest had simply reset the moment they stepped out of it. Back at the station, they reviewed their body cam footage, hoping for proof, anything that could explain what they'd seen. But the strange part was this. Both cameras had shut off at the exact moment the glow first appeared. No errors logged, no malfunctions recorded, just a clean cut to black as if something had deliberately silenced them. The devices came back online only once they had reached the edge of the forest again. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. Neither deputy wanted to write the full account in their report. They knew how it would sound, like stress, imagination, maybe even hysteria. So, officially, they marked it as no contact, no activity observed. But privately, the story spread among the department. Some laughed it off, others raised eyebrows, but the two men who had been there didn't laugh. They refused to patrol that stretch of forest after dark again. Even months later, when calls came from the area, they always found an excuse to send someone else. To this day, both deputies stick by their story. They can't explain what they saw, or the voice on the radio, or the way the forest itself seemed to change around them. They just know that something was out there, something that wanted them gone. And honestly, after hearing their account, I can't blame them. There are places in this world that feel wrong, places where the air feels heavier and the silence seems alive. That night in the woods proved to them that some calls aren't meant to be answered, because the thing calling may not be human at all. And honestly, after hearing their story, I can't blame them. But the fourth tale brings the fear even closer, right into a police station itself. One small-town police station had long carried a strange reputation among its officers. Stories floated around about odd noises in the night, whispers in the holding cells, and the sensation of being watched when the building was otherwise empty. Most of the older cops laughed it off, chalking it up to long shifts, exhaustion, and the kind of nerves that creep in when you're reworking the graveyard shift in a building with too much history. But as much as they tried to dismiss it, none could quite shake the feeling that the station itself was never completely empty, even when every logbook said otherwise. The rookie who discovered the truth didn't expect his night to be anything out of the ordinary. He was covering dispatch, the slowest part of the shift, filing reports and half listening to the low hum of the radios. The rest of the team was out on patrol. The station's old fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering every now and then, and the building itself made the occasional creak as the heating kicked on. It was quiet. So quiet he found himself staring at the clock, counting the hours until morning. Just after 3 a.m., he heard it. Footsteps, faint at first, echoing down the hallway. They were heavy, deliberate, the sound of boots on tile. He straightened, waiting for another officer to appear around the corner. But no one came. Curious, he checked the monitors. The lobby camera showed no one had entered the building, and the side entrance was locked tight. The hallway stayed empty. Still, the footsteps continued, slow and steady, pacing right outside the dispatch room door. Gripping his flashlight, he swung the door open. The sound stopped instantly. The hallway stretched out before him, fluorescent lights flickering weakly, shadows pooled in the corners. It was empty. He stood there for a moment, listening, heart beating faster now before shaking his head and forcing himself to laugh. Lack of sleep, he thought. Stress. He shut the door and went back to his desk, trying to push the unease away. That was when the front lobby buzzer sounded, sharp and jarring in the silence. His head snapped up to the camera feed. What he saw didn't make sense. The door, which was always locked from the inside at night, was slowly swinging open. The camera lens caught it inching wider, but no one pushed it. No figure appeared. Just the door, moving on its own. He sprinted out of the room and into the lobby, his breath fogging in the cold air that had somehow crept in. The door stood wide open. Outside, fresh snow lay across the front steps, untouched, not a single footprint leading to or from the entrance. He closed it quickly, locking it again, and stood for a moment in the empty lobby, trying to steady his nerves. Back at his desk, he sat down and reached for his radio, but before he could speak, static hissed across the channel. Through the static came a voice, low, faint, and chilling. It asked a simple question, one that froze him in place. "Why are you here?" The words were whispered, almost sighing, and yet they were clear enough that he couldn't dismiss them as interference. Panicked, he grabbed his phone and called another officer still on duty. Within 20 minutes, a veteran arrived, and together they searched the entire building. Room by room, hallway by hallway, even the holding cells and supply closets. Every door was secure, every window locked, every room empty. And yet, the entire time, both admitted later that they couldn't shake the feeling of eyes following them, tracking every step they took. When they returned to the dispatch room, they pulled up the security footage again. What they found made the veteran's face go pale. For 3 full minutes, the lobby camera had recorded the faint outline of a man standing just inside the door. He was tall, motionless, blurred around the edges like smoke in the shape of a person. He didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there staring straight ahead. But both of them swore they had been in the lobby at that exact time, and in person, it had been completely empty. Word of the incident spread quickly. Officers who had once laughed at the station's stories began to take them more seriously. Some admitted that they, too, had heard whispers coming from the cells when they were empty, faint voices calling out in the dark. Others said they'd caught glimpses of movement on the cameras, figures slipping down hallways where no one should have been. None of them wanted to be the one assigned to the night shift alone anymore. They started referring to the presence as the station's permanent guest. For the rookie, the experience never faded. He had been trained to face danger on the streets, to expect the unexpected during patrols and traffic stops, but nothing had prepared him for the feeling of being haunted inside his own headquarters. There was no criminal to arrest, no suspect to book, no evidence to log. Just a presence, silent and watchful, that made even the safest building feel like a trap. Years later, the story still gets told to rookies on their first night shifts. Not as an official warning, but as a hushed tale passed from one officer to another. Don't ignore the footsteps, they say. Don't brush off the whispers. If the buzzer goes off at 3 a.m., think twice before you open that door. Because some visitors don't come in from the cold. They're already inside, waiting, and they don't leave when morning comes. And that's the part that makes the story so disturbing. The streets are dangerous, sure, but at least out there you know what you're up against. In the station, where the walls should keep you safe, the enemy is something unseen, something that doesn't belong in the world of reports and patrols. It lingers, reminding everyone who works there that the line between their world and something darker is much thinner than they'd like to believe. And if that's unsettling, the fifth story takes us back on patrol, where an officer learned that sometimes a simple welfare check can be the most chilling call of all. Dispatch sent 2 officers to check on an elderly man after neighbors reported not seeing him in several days. It was the kind of call that rarely raised alarms. Routine welfare check, nothing unusual. They expected to find him asleep, maybe sick, or at worst in need of medical attention. When they arrived, the hallway of the small apartment building was still, the kind of quiet that clung to old buildings late at night. They knocked on his door several times, calling out his name, but there was no answer. The lights inside were off, the curtains drawn tightly shut. After a few more attempts, the landlord came up with a spare key. He looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot, and handed it over without saying much. When the officers turned the key, the door creaked open into a wave of stale, heavy air that clung to their clothes. It smelled faintly of dust and something else, something metallic, almost like rust. They stepped inside carefully, flashlights sweeping across the apartment. The living room was neat, almost too neat. A blanket folded on the couch, remote placed precisely on the table. Nothing out of place. But the room felt cold, strangely cold. Not the natural chill of an empty home, but the kind that made the hairs on their arms rise. One officer called out his name again. Silence answered back, though one of them swore he heard faint breathing in the room, so soft he wasn't sure if it was real. The other officer insisted he heard nothing. They began a search, moving cautiously from room to room. The kitchen was clean, a few dishes drying in the rack, no signs of recent use. The bathroom was spotless, towels folded neatly on the shelf, toothbrush resting by the sink. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet something about the stillness felt wrong. Only one door remained closed. The bedroom. When they pushed it open, they froze. The bed was perfectly made, sheets tight and smooth, untouched. But in the corner, just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam, it looked like someone was sitting there, knees drawn up, body hunched. Both officers caught it at the same moment. Instinctively, they raised their lights, beams crossing into the shadows. The corner was empty. No one sat there, only peeling wallpaper and the outline of a chair pushed against the wall. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. They both insisted later that, for a split second before the light hit, there had been a figure sitting there. The air in the room felt icy, colder than anywhere else in the apartment, and as they called in the all clear, their radios hissed with static that rose and fell like faint whispering. Neither mentioned it aloud, but both felt something unnatural linger in that space. They searched further and found something unsettling by the bed. The man's wallet, glasses, and shoes were neatly lined up, as though prepared for use. It was the kind of detail that made the absence even more disturbing. If he had left on his own, why would he go without them? There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken locks, no blood, nothing at all. Just absence, a void where a man should have been. The search turned up nothing else. They reported back, listing the man as missing. The landlord shook his head and muttered that the man was quiet, never caused trouble, never left without saying something. No one had seen him for nearly a week. The officers left the apartment with the same chill clinging to them, a heaviness they couldn't shake. Later that night, back at the station, as they were writing up the report, one of the officer's phones buzzed. He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. It was a notification from Instagram. He had been tagged in a new photo. Curious, he opened it, and his hand trembled. The photo showed the empty corner of a bedroom. Not just any bedroom. The same one from the apartment, the same corner where they swore they'd seen someone sitting. The image was crisp, almost too crisp, and it felt like it had been taken only minutes earlier. The account that had tagged him had no profile picture, no name, no followers, nothing. Just that one photo. He quickly showed his partner, but when they tried to pull it back up, the post was already gone. Deleted. Vanished, like it had never existed at all. They searched the account, the notification, the tag. Nothing remained. The other officer swore his partner was rattled enough to have imagined it, but deep down, he believed him. The timing was too exact. The detail too precise. The case dragged on for weeks with no new leads. The elderly man was never found. No activity on his bank accounts, no calls from his phone, no sightings reported. It was as though he had been swallowed whole by the apartment itself. Eventually, the case went cold, filed away with a stack of unresolved disappearances. But for the two officers, the memory stuck like a splinter. They still talked about the shadow in the corner, the static on their radios, the icy air that clung to their skin. And, more than anything, they remembered the photo. The one that shouldn't have existed. The one that tagged them directly, as though whatever had been in that apartment wanted them to know it had seen them too. Neither of them ever volunteered for a welfare check again. Even years later, whenever such calls came in, they hesitated, remembering the silent apartment. For them, it was no longer a simple routine. It was a reminder that sometimes, what you find in the quiet isn't just loneliness or tragedy. Sometimes, it's something much harder to explain. And if you think that's eerie, the next story only deepens the unease. Because this time, the call doesn't lead them into an apartment or a home. It leads them onto a lonely highway at 3 a.m., where what waits isn't human at all. And if you think that's eerie, wait until you hear the sixth story, because this one takes place on a lonely highway at 3 a.m. Highway patrol officers are used to the monotony of endless dark stretches of road, the kind of nights where the silence is broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of static from the radio. Most nights are uneventful, just miles of pavement and a steady stream of thoughts to keep them awake. But one shift, in the early hours of the morning, turned into something unforgettable. It was just past 3 a.m. when a deputy cruising along a rural highway noticed movement on the shoulder. His headlights caught the outline of a figure, small against the expanse of black road and open fields. At first, he thought it was just a pedestrian, or maybe someone whose car had broken down. Standard procedure dictated he check it out. He slowed, flicked on the cruiser's spotlight, and aimed it toward the figure. The beam illuminated what looked like a woman in a faded dress. She was standing perfectly still, her head bowed, long hair obscuring her face. He stepped out of the vehicle, boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of chill that carried through the uniform and settled in the bones. He called out to her, voice firm but calm, asking if she needed help, if she was hurt. No response came. The only sound was the wind scraping across the asphalt, carrying the faint rustle of dry grass. He called out again, louder this time. The woman didn't move, didn't flinch. Finally, she stirred. Not with urgency, but with a slow, deliberate turn. Without looking up, she began walking away from him, her movements oddly steady, almost gliding, as she moved toward the darkness at the edge of the highway. He quickened his pace, closing the gap, but when he reached the exact spot where she should have been standing, the shoulder was empty. The deputy swept his flashlight in a wide arc, the beam cutting through the grass and gravel. There were no footprints in the dirt, no broken stems, nothing to suggest anyone had walked there at all. It was as though she had dissolved into the night the moment he reached her. He stood for a moment, listening hard for any rustle of movement in the brush, but all that came back was silence. Uneasy, he returned to the cruiser and sat behind the wheel. The engine's steady vibration was a comfort, grounding him in something real. He glanced at the dashcam monitor, expecting to see only black road and empty shoulder. Instead, his blood ran cold. The screen clearly showed the figure standing there, illuminated by the cruiser's lights. The woman, her long hair hiding her face, her faded dress swaying slightly as if in a wind he couldn't feel. He blinked, leaned closer. Then, before his eyes, the figure began to fade, dissolving like smoke into the darkness until the screen showed nothing but the shoulder and the highway stretching out endlessly. His hands trembled as he grabbed the radio and called for backup. Within minutes, another unit pulled up beside him, the flash of red and blue briefly cutting through the emptiness. The second deputy listened quietly as the first recounted what he had seen. Together, they reviewed the live dash cam feed. This time, there was nothing, just the empty road, cold and unremarkable. And yet, both officers felt it. That pressure in the air, that prickling sensation at the back of the neck that made the hairs on their arms stand stiff. They weren't alone, even if they couldn't see who or what was there. Then the radios came alive with a sudden hiss of static, sharp and loud, making both men flinch. The noise filled the cars for several long seconds, and then, through the distortion, came a whisper. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, drifted through. "Don't stop." Just 2 words, spoken with eerie clarity, chilling them more than a scream ever could. The first deputy quickly checked with dispatch, asking if any messages had been relayed, if there were any female officers on the line. The response came back confused. Nothing had been sent, no other units were nearby, and no one had broken into the channel. Both officers sat in silence, realizing they had just heard something that shouldn't have been possible. They logged the incident officially as no contact, careful not to include the stranger details that would make them sound unfit for duty. But neither ever forgot the pale figure in the dress, the vanishing act on the shoulder, or the voice that told them not to stop. Word spread slowly among locals who heard whispers of what had happened. They weren't surprised. That stretch of highway had long been called cursed by those who lived nearby. For years, there had been stories of accidents. Drivers swerving suddenly, claiming they saw a woman in the road, only to crash when they tried to avoid her. In every account, the woman vanished before help arrived, leaving nothing but wreckage and confusion behind. Some said she was the spirit of a young woman killed in a hit-and-run decades earlier, forever replaying her final moments. Others believed she was something older, something tied to the land itself, luring the living into joining her in the darkness. The 2 deputies never offered an explanation. They didn't need to. They had seen enough to quietly believe what the townsfolk said. Even years later, one of them admitted he still slowed down whenever he drove past that spot, his eyes scanning the shoulder for any hint of a silhouette in the mist. He never saw her again, but he never stopped looking, because some images never leave you. The sight of a lone figure on a highway at 3 a.m., standing still in the beam of headlights, hair hiding her face, body dissolving into air, it etches itself into memory. For those 2 officers, it was no longer just another long, empty stretch of road. It was a place marked by something that didn't belong to the world they knew, something that could appear at will, leaving behind nothing but dread and the echo of a voice telling them to keep driving. And if lonely highways are unsettling, what waits in the next story is worse, because it didn't happen outside on the road. It happened inside a home where an entire family had gone missing, leaving behind questions that no one has been able to answer. And if lonely highways are unsettling, the next story is worse, because it happened inside a house where an entire family had gone missing. Police were dispatched to a quiet suburban street after neighbors reported growing concern about a family of 4 who hadn't been seen in more than a week. Their cars were still in the driveway, unmoved, and the mail had begun piling up at the front door. Lights inside the house stayed off at night, and not a single curtain shifted. The neighbors, who usually saw the children riding bikes out front or the parents tending the yard, grew uneasy. Something wasn't right. When officers arrived, the neighborhood was still. the kind of stillness that makes every sound echo louder than it should. The front door was locked. No answer to repeated knocks or calls of the family's names. They made entry, expecting the worst, a medical emergency, maybe even a domestic tragedy. But what they found was stranger than anything they'd prepared for. The dining room was the first thing they noticed. The table was set for 4, plates and silverware neatly arranged, as though the family had been about to sit down for dinner. Glasses were half filled, napkins folded beside them. It was eerie because the food on the counter in the adjoining kitchen had spoiled. Vegetables shriveled, meat rotting in the open air, and the refrigerator door hung slightly ajar. The scene felt frozen in time, a moment interrupted with no explanation why. They continued upstairs. The bedrooms were neat, almost too neat. Beds made tightly, children's clothes laid out at the foot as if ready for school the next day. Nothing suggested a struggle. No drawers pulled open in a rush, no personal items missing, no suitcases gone. The family simply wasn't there. Parents, children, 2 adults, 2 kids, all vanished, as though they had walked out the front door together and never returned. The search grew more unsettling the longer it went on. The officers checked closets, bathrooms, every corner of the house, but there were no signs of foul play. It was absence, pure and simple. The kind of emptiness that gnawed at the edges of logic. One officer, scanning the basement door, suggested they check below. The others agreed, descending the creaky steps into darkness. Down there, one officer swore he heard the faint sound of children laughing. It wasn't the kind of laughter that echoes from memory or imagination. It was distinct, playful, coming from somewhere in the shadows. The others looked at him skeptically until the noise seemed to ripple through the space again. Softer this time, but unmistakable. Hearts pounding, they flicked on the single bulb dangling from the ceiling. The laughter cut off instantly. The basement revealed nothing but rows of old boxes stacked against the walls, dust thick on every surface. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, not sure what to make of what they'd heard. Back upstairs, the unease only deepened. As one officer adjusted his radio, a burst of static filled the airwaves. Then, faint but clear, a child's voice whispered through the channel. "We're still here." The words froze them in place. It wasn't dispatch, and no other units were on the same frequency. For a long moment, they stared at each other, waiting for someone to explain it away as interference. No one could. They cleared the house again, moving faster this time, as though they could chase down answers by retracing their steps. Nothing had changed. The house remained the same, eerily perfect yet hollow, like a stage set abandoned mid-performance. They stepped back into the neighborhood night with more questions than answers. Later, detectives canvassed nearby houses for security footage. What they found was disturbing. Several cameras clearly showed the family returning home about 10 days earlier. Parents carrying groceries, kids running up the front steps, but none of the cameras ever recorded them leaving. The driveway cars had sat unmoved since that night. It was as if the family had gone inside and been swallowed whole. The investigation stretched on for weeks. Detectives combed through bank accounts, phone records, emails, nothing. No transactions, no calls, no digital footprints of any kind after that night. Flyers went up, search teams combed the woods nearby, but every lead died cold. Neighbors continued to report strange things, though. Sounds of footsteps inside at night, voices carrying faintly through the walls, shadows moving behind the curtains. But whenever police checked, the house was empty. Eventually, the case was declared unsolved, filed away among the department's stack of unresolved disappearances. Officially, it was left open, but in reality, no one had a clue where the family had gone or how 4 people could simply vanish without leaving a trace. For the officers who first entered, though, it wasn't the paperwork that haunted them. It was the details they couldn't forget. The spoiled food, the laughter in the basement, the child's voice on the radio. Some of them swore they'd never go near the property again. Even after the house was sold years later, they avoided driving past. The new owners, eager to make the place a home, didn't stay long. Within months, they too began reporting odd disturbances, children's giggles echoing from the basement, doors closing on their own, the sense of being watched. They left quietly one night, abandoning furniture and belongings, never to return. The house still stands, quiet and ordinary on the outside, but everyone in the neighborhood knows better. They walk their dogs on the opposite side of the street, avoid looking at the windows, and whisper about the family that vanished as though speaking it too loudly might invite the same fate. The official file remains open but untouched, a reminder of a mystery too strange to solve. For the officers, it was the case that stayed with them longest. They had seen crime, tragedy, and accidents that defied reason, but nothing unnerved them more than the silence of that house. Because silence can be explained when someone has left. Silence can be explained when someone has died. But this was different. This was silence paired with presence. An unseen presence that wanted them to know it was still there. And that was the part no one could write in a report. And if that wasn't enough to unsettle even the most hardened officer, the next story moves away from family homes and neighborhoods altogether. It takes us back outside, onto a lonely rural road, where one officer came face to face with something that defied all sense of reality. If that's not unsettling enough, the eighth story drags us back outside, this time to a lonely rural road where one officer faced something impossible. One officer was patrolling a lonely rural back road just after midnight. It was the kind of shift where the silence stretched endlessly, the kind of road where you could drive for miles without seeing another set of headlights. On either side, fields ran off into the dark, broken only by the occasional tree standing like a sentinel against the night sky. The hum of the cruiser ES engine and the faint crackle of the radio were the only sounds keeping him company. He rounded a bend, eyes half-focused on the empty stretch ahead, when suddenly the headlights caught something. A man stood in the middle of the road. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch at the approaching car. Arms hung loose at his sides, his stance unnatural. Too stiff, too still. Instinctively, the officer slowed and brought the cruiser to a stop, heart already beating faster. Encounters on these back roads could mean anything. An accident, someone lost, or something worse. Stepping out of the vehicle, the officer called out firmly, telling the man to move to the shoulder for his safety. His voice carried across the silence of the road, but the figure didn't respond. He didn't wave, didn't gesture, didn't acknowledge the call at all. He just stood there in the beam of the headlights like a mannequin planted in the middle of nowhere. Suspicion flared. He switched on the spotlight, aiming the beam directly at the man. For a moment, the light cut across the figure, but then something impossible happened. The man flickered. His shape wavered like a reflection on disturbed water, breaking apart and reforming in the glare before vanishing altogether. 1 second, he was there. The next, nothing. Empty road, just cracked asphalt glowing under the spotlight. The officer blinked, shaken, and wondered if fatigue was finally catching up to him. Long shifts could do that, play tricks on the mind. Still, unease pressed in. He walked forward cautiously, flashlight beam cutting across the asphalt, scanning the ditches and field edges. Nothing. No movement, no footprints, no sign anyone had been standing there at all. Just the night swallowing everything. Then his radio crackled suddenly, breaking the silence. He reached for it instinctively, expecting dispatch, but what came through wasn't familiar. It wasn't static, not exactly. It was a whisper, low and deliberate, carrying 2 chilling words. Turn back. He froze, pulse thudding in his ears. The nearest unit was miles away. No one else should have been on his frequency, and dispatch had said nothing. Yet the voice was clear, not a trick of interference. Someone, or something, had spoken directly to him. Before he could process it, the cruiser's headlights dimmed, flickering weakly though the engine kept running steady. The air shifted. The temperature dropped so sharply that his breath fogged in front of him, curling white against the windshield as he climbed quickly back inside the car. The cabin felt like an icebox, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing. He shoved the gear into drive, desperate to leave, but the dash cam suddenly burst into static. Lines of distortion streaked across the monitor, and then, for just an instant, the image sharpened. The figure was back, no longer in the road but sitting in the back seat of the cruiser. Blurred, faceless, but unmistakably there. A dark outline, shoulders hunched, as if riding silently behind him. Whipping around, he stared into the empty seat. Nothing. The leather was smooth, untouched, exactly as it had been when he started his shift. But the image on the monitor replayed in his mind, sharper than any dream or trick of the eyes. He didn't hesitate. Slamming his foot on the accelerator, he drove hard, tires spitting gravel until the road opened into the faint glow of town lights again. At the station, he couldn't shake it. His sergeant noticed his pale face and demanded an explanation. Reluctantly, the officer pulled the dashcam footage and replayed it on the monitor. For the most part, it looked normal. Mile after mile of empty highway, dark fields, the steady glow of headlights. But then came the moment. For 3 seconds, the blurred outline of someone appeared in the middle of the road. The figure stood motionless, almost translucent, before vanishing into static. The officer pointed out the flicker, the way it seemed to dissolve like a bad signal. But when the part came where he swore the figure had been in the back seat, the footage glitched entirely, filling with static. Only the audio cut through faintly. A hiss, followed by what sounded like the same whisper he'd heard on the radio. The sergeant leaned back, unimpressed. He'd seen officers spook themselves before, and he wasn't about to log a ghost story. He ordered it to be filed as equipment malfunction, and told the officer to get some rest. But the man couldn't shake the memory. He knew what he'd seen, knew what he'd felt. The ice-cold air, the dimming headlights, the whisper telling him to turn back. It was real, no matter what the paperwork said. In the weeks that followed, he avoided that stretch of road whenever possible, rerouting patrols or asking others to cover it. Some nights, though, he had no choice but to pass it. And every time his eyes darted to the shoulder, scanning for a figure standing motionless in the beam of his headlights. He never saw him again, but the dread never left. The road carried its reputation, whispered about among officers as cursed ground, a place where reality bent and things appeared that had no explanation. Even years later, the officer swore under his breath whenever he thought about it. He wouldn't tell civilians the full story, but other cops knew the look in his eyes when the topic of haunted patrols came up. Some laughed, some shrugged, but the ones who'd been on that same road in the dead of night only nodded in silence. Because once you've seen something like that, it changes the way you drive those empty miles. It changes the way you trust the road beneath your wheels. And though the case was never written up in any official report, the story remained alive in the station, passed between rookies as a warning. If you ever see a man standing still in the middle of that rural back road, don't stop. Don't flash your lights. Just keep driving. Because once you do stop, you might not be the only one in your cruiser anymore. And yet, the 9th story is even stranger, because it didn't happen outside, but inside a jail cell no one should have been in. Every police station has its holding cells. Most of the time, they're uneventful, just drunks sleeping it off, petty thieves waiting for paperwork, or the occasional troublemaker who needs a night to cool down. But every officer who worked the late shift will tell you, those cells have a way of feeling heavier at night. The silence is different, the air somehow colder, and one night, in a small-town station, something happened that no one on duty has ever been able to forget. It started with a routine set of rounds. The jailer was used to walking the corridor, checking each cell one by one. Most were empty that night, except for 1 or 2 low-level arrests sleeping quietly. When he passed cell 3, though, something caught his eye. The motion sensor just outside the bars flicked on, glowing red as if someone inside was pacing back and forth. He stopped, frowned, and checked the logbook. No one had been booked in cell 3 for days. It was supposed to be empty. Curious, he leaned closer, peering between the bars. The cell was dark, the overhead light dead from years of neglect. He hesitated, then pulled out his keyring, the jangle echoing down the hall, and unlocked the door. With his flashlight beam cutting across the cell, he swept the corners. Bare walls, a steel cot bolted to the ground. Nothing else. Dust clung to the floor like no one had walked there in months. He let out a breath, almost laughing at himself, and turned to leave. That's when he heard it. A cough, low, hoarse, coming from the far corner of the cell. He froze, blood running cold. Slowly, he swung the light back toward the sound. The corner was empty. Nothing but concrete blocks and shadow. The beam lingered there for a long moment before he backed out quickly, slamming the bars shut and locking them again with shaking hands. Not trusting himself, he called for another officer to come down. Together, they stood outside Cell 3, staring at the small monitor that displayed the live security feed. For a long minute, the screen showed nothing. Then, as if the shadows themselves had thickened, the outline of a man appeared. He sat calmly on the cot, shoulders hunched, head tilted down. Clear as day, a human shape. Both officers looked at each other, neither wanting to admit what they were seeing. Finally, they rushed back into the cell. The cot was empty, cold to the touch, dust undisturbed. But when they returned to the monitor, the figure was still there, sitting, silent, unmoving. One officer muttered that maybe it was a glitch, a replay from old footage. They called dispatch to check for system errors. The answer came back flat. No glitches reported. The system was functioning perfectly. They stood rooted in place, watching. That's when the shadow lifted its head. Slowly, deliberately, it turned toward the camera. For the first time, its face was partially visible. One officer swore later that he saw a grin forming. Wide, unsettling, stretching too far. Before they could react, the feed cut to black. The screen stayed dead for several seconds, their reflection staring back at them, pale and shaken. Then it blinked back on. The cot was empty again. Neither man wanted to stay in that wing any longer than necessary. They filed a vague report, carefully leaving out the details that would make them sound insane. Camera anomaly, one of them wrote. Unverified motion detection. Nothing more. But privately, both knew what they had seen. The figure on the cot, the grin, the deliberate movement toward the camera. It was something that could be explained by bad wiring or tired eyes. Word spread through the station faster than they wanted. Officers whispered about Cell 3, sharing old stories that suddenly seemed less like jokes. One claimed the cell door rattled at night, though the hallway was empty. Another said he'd heard muffled breathing when he passed, though the cell was vacant. A few went further, saying the figure was a former inmate who had died years earlier during booking, though the records on that were sketchy at best. The stories piled up, each officer adding a detail, each one swearing they'd never sit alone in that corridor again. Cell 3 earned a reputation. Night shifts were shuffled around so no one had to linger near it. New rookies were warned in hushed tones, told to ignore the noises, to keep their eyes down if they caught movement on the monitors. The official line was that it was just old equipment acting up, but no one truly believed that. Even years later, the memory lingered. Some officers admitted they still dreamed about that night. The cough in the dark, the grin on the monitor, the sudden blackout of the feed. They said it didn't feel like a glitch. It felt like something was still there, something using the cell as its own, refusing to leave long after its time should have been over. And if that isn't chilling enough, what came next was worse. Because the final story wasn't about an empty cell or a shadow in the corner, it was about a call that every officer dreads, the kind that stays in your chest long after the shift is over. It began with the sound of a child crying. And if that isn't chilling enough, the 10th and final story is the kind that sticks in your head, because it involves a call every cop dreads, a child in danger. It was close to midnight when the 911 call came in. Neighbors living near an abandoned house on the edge of town reported something they couldn't explain, the sound of a child crying. Not the playful whimper of a tantrum or a distant noise from the street, but deep, aching sobs that carried through the still night air. The callers swore the crying came from inside the house, though the property had been boarded up and empty for years. 2 officers were dispatched. As their cruiser rolled up the cracked driveway, the headlights revealed shattered windows, graffiti splashed across the walls, and weeds clawing up the siding. The place had a reputation among locals. A place kids dared each other to enter, but most avoided once the sun went down. Still, a report of a child in danger couldn't be ignored. They stepped out, flashlights slicing through the dark, beams catching on jagged glass and peeling paint. The moment they pushed open the warped front door, the sound reached them clearly. A child's sobbing, soft and heartbreaking, drifting through the halls. Both officers froze, the hair on their arms rising. It was unmistakable, the kind of sound that hit a human instinct to comfort, to protect. Without speaking, they exchanged a glance and began moving room to room, calling out. "Hello, it's the police. Are you hurt? Where are you?" Their voices echoed off cracked walls, but the crying never answered. It always seemed just out of reach, further ahead, leading them deeper into the house. The living room was gutted, trash scattered across the floor, old furniture overturned and left to rot. The kitchen smelled of mildew, broken cabinets hanging by their hinges. Yet above it all, the sobbing continued. They followed it down the hallway, flashlights cutting across graffiti scrawled in thick black paint, words half faded and symbols no one recognized. Their boots crunched on glass, every step loud in the silence between cries. They climbed the stairs slowly, each creak groaning under their weight. The crying grew fainter but no less desperate. It sounded like a little boy or girl, no older than 7, lost and scared. "We're coming to help you," one officer called, but the sound only shifted again, floating further away. They checked each bedroom in turn. All were empty. Mattresses torn open, stuffing spilling onto the floor, walls stripped bare. Still, the sound tugged them forward. By the time they reached the final door, the one leading up to the attic, the sobbing was faint but steady, coming from above. They hesitated, hands tightening around their flashlights before pulling the door open. The wooden ladder groaned as they climbed, dust showering down with each step. As their heads broke the attic's low ceiling, the sobbing stopped. Silence hit them, heavy and suffocating, as their lights swept across the space. The attic was empty. Nothing but boxes collapsed from water damage, insulation spilling out in tufts. In the far corner, though, something caught their beams. A doll sat upright, its dress tattered, porcelain face coated in dust. Its eyes, painted but eerily lifelike, seemed to stare directly at them. The silence pressed in, louder than any sound. Both officers stood still, waiting, listening for the crying to return. It didn't. One officer crossed the room slowly, crouching near the doll. Up close, it looked older than the house itself, its fabric yellowed with age, stitching fraying along the seams. He reached out, hesitated, then pulled his hand back, a shiver crawling up his spine. The doll smelled faintly of damp cloth and something sweet, almost metallic. He couldn't shake the feeling it hadn't always been sitting there alone. The other officer called in on his radio, voice low, reporting no child found. As he spoke, the device crackled with sudden static. Through the distortion came a faint sound that made both men's stomachs tighten. It was the same crying they'd heard before, soft, distant, echoing, but now it came through the radio itself. The officer froze mid-sentence, the voice of dispatch cutting in a moment later, oblivious to what they had just heard. They finished clearing the attic, though every step felt wrong, like they were intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. When they finally left the house, stepping back into the cold night, both men exhaled shakily, realizing they'd been holding their breath. The crying never returned, but neither of them spoke during the drive back to the station. Later that night, when they reviewed their body cam footage, something else surfaced. For most of the recording, it was normal, just 2 officers moving through an empty, ruined house. But in several clips, the audio captured faint crying, even when neither of them had reacted to it in the moment. Worse still, in the attic footage, as one officer's light swept across the doll, the camera caught a blur in the far corner of the frame. It lasted only a second. A small silhouette crouched low before vanishing the moment the beam of light touched it. They replayed the footage over and over, trying to explain it. Dust, distortion, maybe a trick of shadow. But the shape was too clear, too deliberate. It looked like a child, knees tucked to their chest, head buried in their arms. The officers didn't add that detail to the official report. They logged it as an unfounded welfare call, no contact. The doll was never collected as evidence. Over the following weeks, neighbors continued to report sounds at night. Sometimes it was crying, other times it was laughter, faint and fleeting, carrying across the empty lot. No one moved into the house. It stood abandoned, windows broken, walls rotting, but always with that weight in the air, as though someone, or something, still lingered inside. For the officers, it was the kind of call that left its mark. They could handle danger, confrontation, even tragedy. But what unnerved them wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't. A crying child that didn't exist, a doll that seemed to wait in silence, a recording that showed more than they had seen with their own eyes. And in the back of their minds, one thought remained. If the crying hadn't been real, why had it sounded so heartbreakingly human? All 10 stories are real accounts from officers who lived them. And what makes them unforgettable is not only the details, but the fact that none of them ever found answers. These weren't tales passed down as campfire rumors or exaggerated legends. They came from the mouths of men and women who spent their lives grounded in procedure, logic, and evidence. And yet when they spoke about these moments, their voices carried the same edge of unease. For people trained to stay calm under pressure, who had faced life-or-death situations with steady hands, admitting fear meant something extraordinary had happened. You see, police officers are not strangers to stress. Their shifts are long, the situation's unpredictable, and adrenaline is part of the job. They've seen what most of us never will: accidents, violence, the aftermath of tragedy, but it isn't those things that haunt them most deeply. It's the unexplainable moments, the ones that don't fit neatly into a report or a case file. Because when you can't make sense of what happened, it lingers. It follows you home. It echoes in your thoughts long after your shift is done. What's striking is how consistent the feelings are in each of these accounts. The sudden drop in temperature, the static in the radios, the sense of being watched when no one is there. These are details shared across different times, different places, and different officers who had no connection to each other. It raises the question, how do so many trained observers, people conditioned to notice small details, all describe similar patterns of events that defy explanation? Some argue it's stress, the mind playing tricks after too many hours awake. Fatigue can certainly bend perception, and adrenaline can heighten it. But others point out that these experiences don't fade like stress usually does. They stay sharp in memory, vivid in a way that ordinary exhaustion could never replicate. When an officer who has seen the worst humanity can offer still shudders when recounting a night shift, you know something about that experience struck a deeper chord. That leaves the darker possibility that not everything encountered on duty can be explained by the natural world. Some officers are willing to say it aloud, while others keep it buried between the lines of their reports, afraid of ridicule. Yet if you look closely, you'll find the same hesitations in their voices, the same pauses before they admit, "I saw something I can't explain." The stories also remind us of how thin the line is between the ordinary and the unsettling. A welfare check, a routine patrol, a midnight call, things officers handle every day, suddenly twist into something unnatural. A crying child that isn't there, a driverless car idling on a street, a shadow in a jail cell that smiles at the camera. Each begins in the most mundane way and ends in a place no one wants to acknowledge exists. That contrast makes them even more chilling. Think about it. These aren't people seeking out the paranormal. They're not ghost hunters, not thrill seekers. They're professionals responding to calls, often annoyed at having to check out what seems like nothing. And yet, sometimes nothing becomes something. Sometimes silence carries voices. Sometimes shadows shape themselves into figures. And sometimes the radio you rely on whispers words that no one should be speaking. It's easy to dismiss these accounts as imagination. But if it were only imagination, would entire departments quietly circulate warnings about certain roads, certain houses, certain cells? Would rookies be told, in hushed tones, to avoid glancing into corners or to ignore footsteps that echo behind them on empty nights? These quiet warnings are passed down not because they're fun stories, but because too many officers have felt the same chill, seen the same flicker of movement where none should be. When even police officers admit they're shaken, you know something truly strange happened. Their careers depend on level-headed judgment. Their reports become legal records. For them to hesitate, to edit out details that don't make sense, says more than the stories themselves. It says they fear not being believed more than they fear whatever it was they saw. And that silence, that hesitation, may be the most haunting part of all. So the question is, what do you believe? Are these simply the byproducts of stress, long hours, and exhausted minds creating illusions? Or are they encounters with something that slips past our understanding, glimpses of a world that exists just beyond the edge of reason? Each listener has to decide. Skeptics will point to psychology, to the tricks of the human brain under strain. Believers will argue that patterns this strong can't be coincidence. And in the middle stand the officers themselves, unwilling to swear to either side because all they know is what they lived. And that's why these stories matter, because they don't offer closure. They don't end neatly with an explanation or a culprit brought to justice. They end with silence, static, and unanswered questions. They end with seasoned professionals shaking their heads, muttering that some things will never make sense. And maybe that's the point. Not everything in this world can be explained no matter how much training or logic we bring to the table. So the next time you see flashing lights in the night, take a moment to consider what's unfolding behind them. The scariest part might not be the crime scene, the accident, or the paperwork being filled out. It might be the details that never make it into the report. The footsteps in an empty hallway, the child's cry with no child to be found, the figure that disappears the moment you shine a light. These are the things the officers don't talk about openly, but that linger with them long after. Because sometimes the real horror isn't in the danger they face on the streets. It's in the moments when reality itself bends, when the night holds something just beyond reach, and when the people trained to stand against chaos realize they were powerless to explain what we just witnessed. And that's when you know you've stepped into a story that will never truly end. So, those were 10 real stories that even the officers themselves could never explain. The question is, what do you think really happened? Were they just tricks of the mind, or something far darker? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if you enjoy diving into chilling true stories like these, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because there are many more tales waiting in the dark. Until next time, stay safe.